were hiring my role, they were hiring a head of diversity and inclusion. And I told the CEO in the middle of an interview, I don't want a diversity and inclusion job, which is probably the most confusing thing a candidate had said to them up to that point. But what I really said is, I want to tell you about my theory of equitable design. I want a different job title, and I want to think about this job differently. And he was like, okay.
This is Mind the Ceiling, a show about trailblazing women who are shattering barriers. These are the candid conversations that dig into what the journey to finding purpose and climbing to the top of industries is like. All of the victories, hurdles, bumps and bruises, and celebrations along the way, and the tools you can use to be the next ceiling breaker. I'm your host, Tamara Lane. My guest today is Aubrey Blanche. Not only does she lead equitable design for products and people at Culture Amp, Aubrey has invented her own social science approach to strengthening a culture of belonging in the workplace, which she sources to top-tier businesses, including Atlassian. But that's not the only thing she's invented. Aubrey pioneered MathPath, her identity, and the name of her startup. But we'll explain that later. Her work has been featured widely in Wired, The Wall Street Journal, and more. Between all of that, she manages to advise not only one, but several startups aligned with her values. And this is how she describes her journey to finding purpose.
Accidental.
Explain, why do you think that?
Yeah, so I think my career only makes sense sort of in reverse, and I think I might just be able to tell a compelling story. But I think I've done so many different things in my life across sort of college and my career. And I think that if there's something I've learned about finding purpose, is that so much of finding purpose, and it turns out there's now research to back this up, which I love. I love it when I chance into that, is the story I tell about the work that I do. And I think that's something for everyone. Is often people think of having purpose as what they're doing, and that's actually wrong. So going into a nonprofit or doing some of that, people often think they'll have more purpose there, and that may or may not be true. But it's more about the story we tell about the work that we're doing, and does that story align with the kind of impact that we want to have in the world? So I've been lucky to end up where I am and be able to make sense and tell that story to myself that what I'm doing is meaningful.
And what exactly is Aubrey's purpose?
I would say that my purpose in life is to share the privileges that I've been given and work to make the world as fair as I think it should be.
Okay, so let's really dig into what she means here, and let's look at how she achieves it on a day-to-day basis.
I don't think I have a typical day, and that works for me. So for some people, they like routines and schedules, and that works for them. I'm not that person. I hate when I have the same day, like 4 or 5 days in a row, although I can't remember the last time that happened. So what it looks like is I'm attending meetings for, we call it the people and experience team, right? So the internal people function, attending the leadership meeting there, making sure, looking at our hiring numbers, seeing what sort of partnership DEI needs with what we call TA, talent acquisition, all the way through moderating for executives an equitable leadership coaching program, to the next day, running a manager training on managing and mentoring across racial dynamics, to jumping in and talking to my boss who says, hey, I need a product vision deck in 2 weeks, and we're going to go roadshow it around the company, to just updating a spreadsheet with Culture Amp's best demographic guidance for how to collect demographic data within their own sort of DEI programs. So I'm doing a little bit of everything. And on top of it, I'll be jumping on a podcast or writing an op-ed with the PR team, because I have my own blog where I blog both about the industry, about trends in DEI, but also I talk a lot about my own identity and my journey to understand what that is, because my hope with sharing those bits of my journey and why I'm so grateful to get to be talking to you is my hope that by sharing a little bit about how I figured out my stuff, it can be a little bit easier for other people to figure out who they are and what they want to be in the world.
Those are big questions, but ones that she has worked to answer. So, how does Aubrey see herself? She coined herself as a math path.
So I worked with a branding firm when I sort of needed some expert creative help. And what I was really searching for at that time was like, how do I explain myself? Because I was struggling to articulate who I was in the world. Because so Math Path is a very cute portmanteau of math nerd plus empath. And that's really who I am. So I'm someone who feels everything 75 layers deep, but also my moon is in Aquarius, if that's funny to anyone. And so I analyze every emotion. And I'm also a Virgo. It's just there's a lot of analysis going on. And so for me, it's really about bringing those things together, and rather than thinking of them as different ends of a spectrum, actually thinking about how can we get those to coexist together. So that's the Math Path. The Math Path is also my business where I do coaching and training as well as consulting on equity and equitable design topics across sort of people and talent systems, as well as sort of a niche part of that practice is helping AI companies think about how to develop processes to ensure more equitable algorithmic design. So that's deep nerd, deep tech, but I kind of love it. But yeah, that's where it came from, is working with some creative folks, sort of doing some deep interviews with me and looking at my methodologies. And what came out of that work was, oh, you're a math path. And as soon as I heard it, I actually burst out crying. And I was just like, that makes so much sense. Finally, I make sense. And that was a big eureka moment.
Honestly, this is inspiring, being able to find a way to explain something so meaningful. But of course, I've got to know, how did Aubrey become a math path and recognize it? To find that out, let's rewind.
Okay, so I'm from Traverse City, Michigan, which is, if you can't see me on the podcast, but if you look at the back of your left hand and look right at your pinky nail, that's where it is. It's a town of, probably the town itself is about 15,000 people, and the metro area is about 100,000. It's very cosmopolitan nowadays and was pretty progressive back then. But I went to a teeny tiny high school called St. Francis High School. So I graduated with only 71. I think there were 71 people in my class if you didn't count the exchange students. So about 74 if you did. And I was Susie High School. Like, I was both the nerdiest nerd and also like, doing one of the leads in the school play and the drum major of the band and running the school yearbook. So I've always been a bit of an overextended human.
But that St. Francis, and this sounds like a Catholic school. Was it a Catholic school?
I did. I have never gone to a public school. So I went to Catholic school from preschool all the way through to my high school graduation.
And how did high school and even going to a Catholic school shape you towards your career?
Yeah, I think so I'm no longer practicing as a Catholic, but I think the sort of the Jesus message about like be kind to others and pay your taxes. And I know that Catholicism and Christianity is much more complicated than that, but I think that particular thing really drove me. So I also was a cantor and a singer at Mass basically every Sunday growing up. And the teachings that I learned from the priest, his name was Father Ken. He's just like exactly what a follower of Jesus should be, just like the warmest, most loving, accepting, non-judgmental, kind person. And so I think that really resonated with me. Ultimately, I think the institutions and the systems of the church didn't work for me, and so I moved away from that. But that I think really shaped my worldview. There was a story that my dad, he told at my wedding, and I don't know why, but I'm going to tell you now, which was I was maybe 6 or 7, and I used to like steal my dad's books and try to read them before he noticed. And one day I read something and I came running into the room and I was like, Dad, and told him about some injustice. I didn't use that language, but I was like, that's not fair. And he looked at me and he said, the world's not fair. And I got very angry at him and left the room, and he followed me and he said, why are you so angry? And I said, what a lazy thing to say. And I was just so bereft that my dad thought that the world being unfair was just the thing we should leave. And so I think in some ways, I've always been this person. I've just maybe gotten a little more colorful or added a bit of vocabulary.
Justice and fairness would remain important concepts to Aubrey throughout her entire life. But in high school, she struggled with moments where she wasn't treated fairly. And what do you think she did? Well, she bravely spoke up.
I got teased for being Mexican quite a bit. So they called me Aubrito, and would in a group project, they would say, well, you sharpen the pencils because Mexicans do the service jobs. So things that are right, clearly just not great. But I was so upset about these boys in my math class teasing me, telling me that like I was going to fail chemistry and that I didn't know how to do this. I'm crying, and I go to my dad, and he looks me dead in the face and he says, you're not as good as the boys at math. And I just almost thought I was going to die. And then he goes, you're much better than them. And the only way for them to beat you is if you quit. And so that moment, my dad would never like call himself a feminist, but we know on the DL. But that was something for me, is that I've been very, very lucky that my parents, especially my adoptive parents, really constantly told me, like, you can do whatever you want to do. So what do you want to do? And my answer was kind of always everything.
I'm curious, looking back at that, like, what do you think now about that situation and what you wish you would have known?
Yeah, I think what I wish I would have known, that it was a social problem and not an individual problem. So it wasn't until I went to college and learned, so I'm white assumed or white passing. And people stopped being racist to me in college, and it was like magic. And that's how I learned about racism and skin tone. And it was in grad school when I was in a program for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students that I grew a sort of social consciousness around it. So because I didn't have other students of color, or really people of color for the most part in my family, my dad is Native and white, but he's also white passing. And I didn't have anyone to talk to about those things. And so I didn't understand that they weren't just individualized teasing, that this was a systemic problem until I was in my mid-20s. And I think I would have felt less alone had I understood this isn't an Aubry problem. I don't think it would have changed that it was really crap, to be honest. But I think that's it. I wish that I had had a broader mental model of the social consciousness that I could have had much earlier.
It takes a lot of strength to overcome bullying, really at any age. But it wasn't until college that she was really able to reflect on it.
I went right to college, and I went to Northwestern, which is just outside of Chicago. And I think it was a great experience for me. I wanted to go somewhere that was really rigorous. And so that's why I chose Northwestern, and they had more trees than some of the other schools that I went to. So I know that sounds very silly, but when you grow up in the woods in the Midwest, and also my mother was thrilled because it was only about 7 hours away. And I did make my decision independently, but my dad had decided when they were in the Rose Bowl back in the 90s, it was the school he wanted me to go to. So I happened to have made my parents very delighted. But yeah, I went straight to college, and I was originally going to enter as a vocal performance major. So I thought I wanted to be an opera singer, but I actually ended up changing my application and applying so that I was entered as a journalism student.
An opera singer?
Yes. So vocal performance was switched during my application process to journalism.
And I'm curious why.
I think for me, the vocal performance, by making it my major, it took a lot of the joy that I had in it. So I had been in choir all through singing at church and in the choir in my high school and doing musicals and things like that growing up. And it made it too serious, and I wanted to keep it as my joy. And when I was trying to figure out what else I should do, I realized that I wasn't very good at making up stories, but I really liked writing and asking questions. And Northwestern had a great journalism school. So I was like, okay, I'll just do that. But yeah, it was a little bit of an arbitrary choice, but one that I think was ultimately served me really well.
And what classes or experiences in college really impacted you in finding your purpose?
Yeah. So one class was called The History of Israeli Politics. Probably did more for me than anything else. And it was mostly because I got to study with this incredible professor named Eli Raches, who came from Tel Aviv University. And that combined with my Arabic class. So one of my majors ended up being Middle Eastern languages and civilization. But that class on Israeli politics, when I kept turning in my papers, the professor jokingly threatened to kick me out of the class because he's like, "You keep writing political science papers in my history class." And I said, "Well, what is political science?" And he was like, "Go to the building, here across the street and go find someone to take you in." and so he's a lovely man. I should give him so much credit. And I ended up finding a mentor and an advisor named John Caverly from that who he's now, I believe, at the Naval War College or something. He's a great dude. But anyway, and that was the moment that I learned about social science. So I was actually writing social science papers in a history class. And I was so lucky that this professor saw that I had a knack for thinking in a certain way and kind of said, "Here's where your people are." But the other thing is that major, in addition to journalism and political science, so I was at triple, I ended up living in Jordan and Tajikistan over the course of my undergrad career. And I think having the incredible opportunity to live in other places where systems are very, very different has shaped me in so many ways. I think it's made me less judgmental, more understanding, certainly less in love with US imperialism. But really, I think that moment where he saw me and said, "Here's your place." And I went and I found all of my security studies buddies who wanted to talk about international security and mercenaries and, terrorist organizational behavior, which is what I ended up doing in grad school. But that moment, I think, really changed my life. That combined with my first Arabic teacher was Palestinian and his family was from the West Bank. And so getting to understand something that is one of the most contentious political conflicts in the world, but from the point of view of a human being, and how that affected his life, and hearing about things like how he'd been beaten at checkpoints. I think that there is so much we learn about human dignity and about human beings by hearing those N=1 stories and not just sort of intellectualizing the conflict as a security problem. And so I had the luck to learn about all of that during it was actually 5 years at Northwestern. I took a victory lap.
But what I'm hearing actually is you were taking some chances. You were trying new things. You were, you weren't staying in your comfort zone. And so and was there any thought process to that? Or were you just excited? What about people thinking about this and thinking, well, I could never study abroad, or, how would I even go about that?
So I have this rule, I guess, that I've tried to follow in my life, which is if someone offers you something interesting and you have no compelling reason to say no, say yes. So a good example is the State Department, through their Critical Language Fellowship program, because I also studied Farsi, offered to do the critical language scholarship in Tajikistan. And I signed before I knew anything about the country. I just agreed to go because I was like, well, the State Department's offering me a fellowship and it's international and I'll learn something. Signed, committed for, 5 months to go. And then the next question is, I was like, where is Tajikistan? And that sounds very ignorant, and it was. And that is also what my mother asked me. But so I think I try to follow that rule is if I don't have a compelling reason to say no, and it doesn't seem deeply unsafe, I try to say yes, because I think that's how I learn the most. And if there's any quality I have that sort of dominated my life, it's been that I have this, I just want to know why. And it doesn't really matter what the topic is. I want to know why people have constructed different spiritual systems, why people disagree in certain conflicts. My dissertation that I never wrote looked at why do we use private security contractors when it's counter to counterinsurgency logic? And so for me, I think I'm so much better at understanding why when I understand different people. And often that means I need to meet them where they are, not ask them to meet me where I am.
Well, and that almost goes into then where you started launching kind of the career that you're at now. That's like, it seems like that's a part of the thought process, right?
Absolutely. I mean, so I went straight to grad school after college. And actually, to be technically precise, I didn't actually get my degree from Northwestern until about a month after I started at Stanford, which was a whole problem. Because I had taken some time off. Like many women, I was sexually assaulted and needed to take time off during my studies to finish. And I often talk about that because I want to normalize that those things happen on our journeys. But yeah, I mean, at Stanford, I was going deep on political science, learning social science methodologies, starting to build a dissertation that looked at sort of the US's involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I ultimately was in that program just for a year and a half, so I didn't finish. And that was a really hard lesson for me. I'm not a quitter. I generally don't give up on things. And so it was a huge, I think at the time, I felt that it was a huge failure when I dropped out of grad school. And then I landed in tech where dropping out of grad school is trendy, but that was never sort of my ethic, even though it ultimately was the right choice for me.
Well, can you dig in a little bit on that? Like, I mean, the feeling of failure, and actually, I think I don't think it's actually what we just put on our Instagram today about how women feel failure much more intensely than men do. And so, you said that you felt like a failure, but what did you gain from that? And like looking back on it, how you feel about that choice?
Yeah, I think ultimately it was the right choice for me. I wasn't in the right environment to pique my curiosity. Research can be a lonely and sort of individualized game. And I, didn't, it wasn't the right thing for me. And so leaving was good. But at the time I looked at it as failure, like, oh, you said you were going to go get a PhD and you didn't do it. Dang. But what I think it's taught me is to be gentler when you need to change tactics. So often, at least for me, the kind of person who says yes a little bit willy-nilly, you could say, is that sometimes you jump in and it isn't the right thing, but it's more like you found something that didn't work. So it's a cliche for a reason, but they say, oh, I haven't failed. I've simply found 1,000 ways it didn't work. And I think that's part of it is in college, I had such a tiny understanding of like what jobs were available. And certainly I had never heard of a chief diversity officer, and certainly had never heard of a director of product and people. One, because I don't think I've actually made it up. I don't want to take that much credit, but like, it's not that common. And so I think part of it is knowing that changing course is a part of the course. And that it's okay to do that. And it's okay to go back to what feels like square one. I guess the other thing I want to talk about is how visible people's successes are and how invisible their failures are. So I think people could look at me as having a successful career, but what people don't know is that when I decided to drop out of grad school, I sat down on a Labor Day weekend. I applied to 127 different jobs that weekend, and I got callbacks for I think 6 or 7 of them. And I ultimately only got one job offer. And so I took that job offer because I had to pay my rent. And so you don't see the 126 jobs that were like, absolutely not, she's not a fit. All you hear is, Aubrey got this job. And so that's a part of it. Even my last job search, I was searching for probably over 2 years, not because I was miserable in my current job, but because I wanted to be working more in product. And so I had dozens of failed or it wasn't the right fit job interviews. And that doesn't mean I failed. It just means the right thing hadn't hit yet.
Well, and so sometimes we can think about that as a challenge, right? Like,
Mhm.
and so I kind of want to think tactically here. How do you approach a challenge and what do you do to then either overcome it or think about it differently?
Yeah, I think I am like I often think of myself as the unstoppable force. Like I'm just so dogged at pursuing certain things. I will just, although that's not always great, right? Sometimes it means I've broken all the china. But I think for me, what I often think is, what have I learned and what door has opened? And also understand that you have to keep asking that question, because there are moments, and I don't want to devalue that, like sometimes the answer in the moment is absolutely nothing. So I'll talk about a story from college that I think is really important, which is, when I and a content warning, I talked about sexual assault. I'm going to talk about that here. So for folks who want to skip ahead like 30 seconds, or need to, I was raped when I was in college, and I had a PTSD episode severe enough that I needed to be hospitalized. I took 6 months off of study, and I'm okay now. Like I'm absolutely a survivor, but I was right in the middle of applying for PhD season, basically. And I was pretty sure that my dream of going to wherever, somewhere that would let me in, was done. And I still got through my applications, and I had an incredible, mentor and advisor who helped me and called those committees and explained what had happened and why it was a special circumstance. But until those letters came in, I really thought that I was at the end of the line. I hadn't been preparing to be a journalist, so I hadn't been doing the types of internships that I should have been to go in that career. I had no idea what else I could be doing. I was like, what jobs does someone with a journalism and Middle Eastern studies degree get? And so there are moments where I've just felt absolutely at the bottom of the rung. And part of it was just taking time to heal. I moved back in with my parents like a good millennial. Um, but so, yeah, so I would say when I've hit those challenges, part of it is having respect for feeling like everything's gone. That's okay. Um, but also understanding that there's always another path. This world is changing so much. And so what I would say is, I want to respect that moment and also tell you that it will pass. This too will pass. It always does. But you can control the way that it passes. Can you find something that you love? And also, not every step has to feel like it's in a direction.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
I think that that's important for everyone to realize, that we need to talk about these things, and that people who've experienced it don't have to live in silence. And so thank you. After grad school, Aubrey found another step to take her down her path: her first job in business development at a major tech firm.
So my first job, what made me take the leap was I had decided grad school wasn't the right path, and I needed a job, and tech was the primary industry, and my boyfriend was staying in the Bay. That's just the most honest I can possibly be about it. And so I made a spreadsheet. I did some research. I found like 8 job profiles that might hire me, everything from recruiting coordinator to like copywriter. Because I was like, what skills do I have? I have a bunch of random skills, but nothing that qualifies me for a job. And so I ended up making 8 different resumes and spending a whole weekend like sending them out to everybody and hoping somebody would bite. And 7 out of those 127 did. But really, my first job I got was as a business development writer at a company called Palantir Technologies. I wasn't there very long, because very quickly I learned that the tech industry was just as inequitable and imbalanced as as academia was. And I was lucky enough, I sort of did diversity, equity, inclusion work second shift, working with ERGs. And then I was lucky enough to get put in the position to be a DEI program manager. And very quickly after that, I jumped to Atlassian. So they called and said, do you want to set up our like first, DEI program? And I said, yes, and if I thought about it longer, I should have said, like, why did you hire me? I was 26 and so unqualified, but I was totally sure that I could just science it. Like I had no idea about corporate hierarchy or politics. I was not good at that type of a thing, but I was just like, this is a science problem. And so I ran after it, and I was lucky to have a hiring manager who believed in me.
Well, and I was going to ask, because at such a young age, you had such a large responsibility, but you were also dealing with high level stakeholders. And so how did you navigate that situation? Like, how'd you navigate it?
I think part of it was I had really great mentors, and I've been someone who's always been okay asking for help when I felt like I was out of my depth. So that's something I see where people fail most often is they think that anyone doesn't have like an entire board of directors circling around them helping them out. So anyone I know at least who's been successful has never done it on their own. And that's not to poo-poo their success or anything like that, but rather just like this stuff is really hard. Making change is really hard. I had hiring managers, I had executives on my team who were, pushing to make me successful. And then it goes back to, I think I had really great social scientific training. And so I used those methods to begin to chip away at different pieces of what we needed to do to evolve Atlassian to be a more equitable organization. And along the way, I learned the organizational politics wrangling and things like that. So I think for me, I talk about my curiosity, but I really never wanted to stop learning. And so, yeah.
Never stop learning. That's such an important principle to live by, because when we learn from our mistakes, we succeed. And Aubrey's career has not been short of success.
I think most of the important successes come from like one-off conversations I have with people where they say, this system you built made a difference, or I got to go build this thing because I was given this opportunity because of something you did or said. So like the things that really give me joy, like I love a good system. I love a good press launch, like that's all fun. And I love to high five the team and, everybody that played a little part in getting it there. But for me, the things that matter the most or land the deepest are when someone says, thank you. What you did made a difference in my life. And so there isn't necessarily one specific thing, but that's what keeps me motivated is when someone just says like, hey, what you did worked. It mattered because it changed my life. That is like the biggest privilege and blessing that you could have. And I know I sound like a Hallmark card. But for me, that's really it is I'm someone, so I talked a little bit about being adopted, and I was adopted out of a pretty rough situation. And given to parents who were incredible and middle class and could afford all of those things. And so for me, I talked about sort of sharing so much of my privilege being a part of my purpose. And so when I figure out that you're like, oh, you've hit the nail on the head this time, you like for real help somebody. And now they can go build something better in the world because you did something. They're just like, I can't imagine getting something better. Like, who needs Christmas? Who needs my birthday? So I think that's it, because I've been given so much, and to be able to have successfully replicated that is just ace.
So now we want to dig into some tools that have helped her on her path and concepts you can use yourself. Well, I think sometimes we as women don't necessarily take credit for the deep skills that we have that lead to that success. So what would you say some of those skills are that like help you on a daily basis that are also leading to, every step that you take building your career?
Yeah. So I'm really, really good at sending an email. Like that sounds absolutely silly to say, but like I can write you an email for any situation. So are we defusing an angry customer? Are we responding to an emotional outpouring or someone experiencing trauma? That's usually a don't send an email, jump on the phone type situation. Or do you need to explain like a plan of attack or a vision or a project or next steps or like recap your meeting? Like I am your girl. And really what that comes down to, I know, I'm so proud of this. It's very silly. But the reason I think the core skills underneath that are that I'm able to have empathy and put myself in the seat or in the boots of the person that I'm speaking to. And so I've spent so much time observing and watching people. I feel very lucky to have built that skill of empathy. And so it helps me be more effective at connecting with other people. And I'm one of those people who I don't believe that women are inherent or, sort of femmes are inherently better at this emotional stuff. I think that we've often been socialized to be better, but I think that's one of my superpowers. Although I think the other superpower, and this comes from, I don't know, living under the white, cis hetero patriarchy, is I always assume there's a chance I'm wrong. So being wrong is not the worst thing in the world. Continuing to be wrong is the worst thing in the world, right? Like not hearing that feedback. And so I think for me, that's it, is I've always been really good at taking constructive feedback, or reasonably good, I think, compared to maybe some other people. And then the last one is my curiosity, because I assume that I don't always know. I'm always asking the question, what or why or how? And I think that when you grow up in a world that tells you that you can't be much, it forced me to have imagination. So I grew up knowing that I was Mexican American, and really, the only depictions in my childhood that I saw were either maids or the love interest of Zorro. And just to be honest. And so in order to believe that I could be a professor, for example, I had to have an imagination, because I didn't have access to other Latinas in positions of power to look up to. Even though there were lots of women who looked like me, I didn't identify with them because I knew that they were white and I was other. And so I think those are the skills that I brought to it, is just like, you can have an imagination. I also am into sci-fi and, speculative fiction and things like that. And I think the reason I love speculative fiction and all those things is because it forced me to want to connect with people, which I think is part of imagining. Like, the more life experiences that you get to connect with and see and know, I think the broader your imagination can be. And ultimately, I think that's something that's helped me in every aspect of my life. I think it's made me humble. Hopefully it's made me have vision that people want to follow.
Well, and so I've got a few more questions, and I want to respect everybody's time. So I'm going to try and go through these quickly, but
I will be best.
Is there something that you have learned along the way that you wish you knew earlier?
Oh, I wish I knew that you can be majorly wrong and it's okay. I think I always knew I could be wrong, but I think that failures will pass. And the other piece of advice is your feelings are real, but they may not be true.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How often have you been the only woman in the room, and how do you handle that?
Oh, very often. I handle it by being a very big presence and never really having concerns about speaking my mind. But I think part of it, shoulders back, sit up, speak from your chest. I think that helps. But for me, I played sports and things like that, so I've always tried to find commonalities with the guys in the room, which some people may or may not work for some people, but for me, that's always been, I want to talk about computers and engineering as much as I want to talk about empathy and what we're doing for socializing.
Well, and I want to bring us full circle. You said that you actually designed your title and your role for where you're at now. How did you even approach, that topic before you're even offered the job? Like, how did you decide that was what you were going to do? You're going to go in there and say, I'm completely honest, this is what I want.
Yeah, so I just was really sure I was right about that particular thing. And I think part of it was because I was like, you're a CEO, you're not an expert in my field. Let me tell you as an expert how you should be doing this. Because for me, that interview was like an audition. So just like when I used to do theater, it was like, well, why don't I go in and be the most me I can, so he can decide whether he actually wants to like to cast me in this role. And so I think I had also failed at getting so many other jobs at that point. I was like, what's one more failure?
So I might as well get the exact position I want. I'm going for it.
Yeah, right? Like otherwise you have to pretend to be somebody else the whole time. And that is just exhausting.
Words can be so powerful. And so I'm asking everyone, is there a word that you've been called that you actually find one of your most powerful characteristics?
Oh, generous. When people say that to me, it touches me right in the heart.
If you could go back and tell yourself anything at 15, what would it be?
Take computer classes on the side. So I took all the technology courses available at my tiny high school, but I wish I had gotten into coding when I was younger.
And that is it. The unfiltered, undeterred journey of Aubrey Blanche, a passionate trailblazer leading equitable design in the workplace. And now it's time for the Mind the Ceiling Mindful Minute with Anika Uden, our podcast's associate producer and potentially your company's next CEO. Anika, take it away.
My first question for you is, what book changed your life or impacted you the most?
The Alchemist. I read it about every year.
Wow.
And I learn something new every time.
Cool. Who is your most influential role model?
My mom. She's like the best person that I know. She's really smart and she's so kind and generous and caring. Like if I grow up and people tell me I'm like her, then I've totally nailed humanity.
Yeah. What organizational tool can you not live without?
GCal.
Agreed. What do you do to find calm or to chill out?
I do headstands in my kitchen.
Really?
Yeah, it by putting your heart above your head, it kicks on your nervous system and gives you a relaxed response.
Awesome. You learn something new every day. If you could have a superpower, what would it be and why?
Oh, I think I would kind of love to fly. It doesn't seem like it has a lot of utility, but that seems fun.
Yeah, definitely. And what is the next ceiling you want to break?
I'm really trying to make VP right now. So that is the big sort of career moment for me is looking at having a bigger impact at Culture Amp.
Well, we're cheering you on, and that's it for the Mindful Minute.
And that is our show, Mind the Ceiling. And here, we don't mind the ceiling because it's meant to be shattered. We are here for you, so please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to us and follow us on social media and share with your friends. And we'd love to hear from you. Hit us up on social media to ask our guests questions or celebrate your success with us. We would love to cheer you on along your journey. And with that, what makes us excited about the future?
The fact that like something like 20 to 25% of Gen Z is like, I'm probably queer.
And in Aubrey's career?
I think the thing about Culture Amp is that it's a company that really wants to make a difference. And so they also, like at the core of the company, they care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I feel like I'm in a little playground almost of work. And yeah, that's it. I love being surrounded by Culture Amp calls both the employees and community people geeks. And so being surrounded all day by people who truly want to make the world better, who want to help people sort of actualize at work, I think is just such a privilege. I love that the people and data people are my people and I get to hang out with them all day.